Hello, welcome everybody, and welcome to the very first colloquium of the 24-25 season. I'd like to welcome you on behalf. My name is Leon Potter. I'm the chair of the theater department. And on behalf of the Colloquium Committee in the Arts and Humanities, I would like to welcome you to today's talk, which is fantastic. For starters, I would like to say thank you and acknowledge that we are standing and working today on the traditional lands of the Snuneymuxw First Nations. We're very grateful for this. We really appreciate the ability and the chance and the opportunity to do this. So right now, I'd also like to acknowledge extend a hand of welcome and acknowledgement to the Dean of Arts and Humanities, Dr. Claire Brogan, whose support has continued to make the colloquium possible. So we really appreciate that. Thank you very much, Claire. Really great. And at this point, I would like to hand it over to Catherine Rollwagon, who will introduce today's speaker.
Okay. I'm being told not to touch the microphone, so I'm just going to speak up. Good morning. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Crover this morning, whom I am grateful to call a colleague and a friend. We didn't know each other at the time, but apparently in 2003, we both graduated from the BA program at the University of Victoria in different disciplines. Sarah went on to complete her MA at the University of Toronto and her PhD at UBC. It's hard for me to believe that she's been here at VIU for 5 years because she's been such an active part of the faculty since her arrival in 2019. Teaching full-time and serving in numerous English department, A&H faculty, and university-wide roles, all while continuing to publish actively in her field. She has most recently co-edited a special issue on A Midsummer Night's Dream for Shakespeare Bulletin. We were just chatting about how the theater is producing A Midsummer Night's Dream next semester. And she's currently working on a co-edited collection with Elizabeth Hodgson, on early modern queenship. Her book project is entitled Stage and Street, Theatrical Water Shows and the Cultural History of the Early Modern Thames. It's no surprise to me that she received a VIU Early Career Research Excellence Award just last year in 2023. And despite all her hard work teaching and researching, she can still be spotted in local thrift shops, hunting for treasures, and on rare occasions, driving the mystery machine in tap shoes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Crover.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Catherine. And I promise I'm not going to text while I'm up here, but I need to keep track of the time or I could go on forever. So I have my phone. Thanks are also due to Theo and the Colloquium Committee for setting up this opportunity, to Robin and the theater students for arranging all the tech, and to Eliza for promoting it. I am speaking to you today from Vancouver Island University on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw people, but the tourist attraction I'm discussing inhabited the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people and the Esquimalt Nation. So I offer my thanks to both communities. Also, I'm very grateful to have the chance to share this project with all of you. And I should remember to use the slides. If they work. They were working. Maybe I'm just shorting out all the electricity. Is this the time to start the dance part?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I think the projector is where the light is up there at the booth. You want to point it out?
Okay, got it. I'm an early modernist. I don't do technology. So, yes. So this is a general layout of the territory I am speaking about today. And that is where Anne Hathaway's cottage used to be, just across the water from the inner harbor. Before continuing, I also want to acknowledge a few organizations and people. So the members of the Esquimalt Municipal Archives offered invaluable assistance during my research. And thanks are also due to my colleagues, Dr. Robert Ormsby at the Department of English at Memorial University in Newfoundland, and Dr. Catherine Rollwagon, who you just saw, Department of History, for their generously provided expertise on Shakespeare tourism and 20th century BC tourism marketing, respectively. A version of this paper was presented at the European Shakespeare Research Association conference in Budapest in 2023, which was also supported by a WWII grant. As you have just heard, my natural research home is the early modern period, and particularly the 16th century, and more particularly than that, London, England. Today's project is a departure for me, both in time and space, and the most current thing I've worked on. I find all this modernity a little dazzling. But this project has been taking shape in the back of my mind for quite some time. I was born and raised in Victoria, as was my mom and her mom. So I am intimately familiar with and somewhat oblivious to the strangeness that is the Victoria aesthetic. As a small child, I was already aware of Shakespeare and his wife, Anne Hathaway. I blame this knowledge on my incipient lit nerd tendencies. I was even aware that they came from England. I was also aware that Anne Hathaway's cottage, confusingly, was in Victoria, Canada. I think when I thought about it at all, I assumed that Hathaway must have relocated to BC at some point, like so many English expats. It wasn't until I was an undergrad at UVic, working in the tourism industry during my summers off, that the incongruity of the whole idea of an Elizabethan English thatched cottage set up as a tourist attraction in Victoria, BC, struck me. And no, I did not work at the cottage, alas, though many of my friends did. Since then, I have often thought about the whys and wherefores of this particular attraction, and noted that, to my knowledge, very little scholarship exists on this topic. So, when the opportunity arose to pitch it to a conference, I jumped at it. Around the same time, I happened upon a souvenir Anne Hathaway's Cottage, Victoria, BC ashtray in a local thrift store, as you might guess. It seemed like fate, and here we are. Oh, and lastly, I just want to note that at times I may use the term Indian, but only to quote a source that used that term. There are two quotations that shaped my thought around this project, and I want you to keep in mind as I speak. First, thus they left the castle and took their way towards a mountain and spring which never was, nor ever had been, only a fiction cunningly framed to compass her intentions. This is Mary Roth's Urania from the 17th century. And the second quote, "The truth about stories is that that's all we are," by Thomas King, the Indigenous Canadian author, in his larger text, The Truth About Stories. Victoria, BC, Canada has had a love affair with England since colonization. A big part of its self-fashioning has been centered around recreating a fantasy of Old England. It has worked at cultivating a quaint, middle-class Englishness of the same era. This impulse extends to appropriating the cultural capital that was most touted by the empire as it expanded its grasp across the globe. In other words, the celebration and insistence upon the superiority of the English literary canon. From streets in his name to festivals of his works, Victoria has long participated in the adoration of one of the literary canon's most lionized members, Shakespeare. It is not surprising then, in the wake of World War II, in a young capital city anxious to solidify its distinct Canadian-British identity, that some local English enthusiasts recreated the Bard's principal home and marketed it as a tourist attraction. They arranged for the grand opening in 1959 to coincide with a royal visit by Elizabeth II. For 50 years, Anne Hathaway's cottage, an exact replica of the thatched original and its gardens, was a fixture in Victoria, a must-see on the tourist circuit. Drawing upon the work of Patricia Badir, Michael Dawson, Robert Ormsby, and others on Shakespeare in Canada and Tourism BC, as well as the materials in the Esquimalt Municipal Archives, this paper seeks to explore the post-war impulse for British Columbians, and specifically citizens of Victoria, to rely upon Shakespeare and Shakespeareana to support their nationalist ambitions and establish a sense of identity distinct from the much more populous American states nearby, while largely erasing the lived reality of the Indigenous and non-British cultural histories of this settler community. Rather than engage with its own violent colonial past and attempt meaningful social reparations, citizens mobilized a sanitized vision of Merry Olde England to paper over the fault lines between the white settler, foreigner, and Indigenous communities, and imagine instead a venerable and harmonious English city. In other words, Shakespeare was deployed to avoid acknowledging that any reparations were necessary. By staking its own claim to ownership of Shakespeare, I argue, Victoria, and this attraction in particular, sought to use a time of post-war prosperity and sweeping change to establish its own cultural capital by performing a fantasy of integral embeddedness in the British Empire through a fabricated neighborliness with Shakespeare, himself a conscripted cultural signifier of the glories of Englishness. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, hang on, and who? So before I continue, I'll just give a quick refresher for those of you who don't, shockingly, have these details at your fingertips. William Shakespeare, the famous poet, actor, and playwright, lived from 1564 to 1616. His wife, Anne Hathaway, 1556 to 1623, outlived her husband by about 7 years. Their home in Stratford-upon-Avon was, most likely, her childhood home. Thus, we call it Anne Hathaway's cottage, not Shakespeare's cottage. It is now run as a major English tourist attraction by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and it was being run as a tourist attraction by the Trust since they purchased it in 1892, when they also paid a descendant of Hathaway, Mary Baker, to open up the cottage for literary tourists. Most of the layout of the cottage and its gardens was established around that time. But this layout and aesthetic has become canonical, as you will see. So while reproductions of the cottage may strive for a perfect replication of the attraction at Stratford-upon-Avon, we have little evidence that the original is original, no matter how dearly the faithful may wish it so. But I digress. It would be a misrepresentation to suggest that Victoria, or even British Columbia alone, have an enduring preoccupation with Shakespeare and empire. All of Canada, with the possible exception of Quebec, has drawn heavily on the Bard to shore up their sense of legitimacy and culture. A selection of early to mid-20th century Canadian elementary school textbooks bear witness to this passion. Whether they are composition texts or readers of short stories and poems, Shakespeare is among the most heavily represented of the literary canon. Whoops, I went back. John of Gaunt's famous speech in Richard II extolling the sceptered Isle of England and the British Isles as an other Eden and demi-paradise, for instance, is framed in some of these texts to suggest both an homage to the motherland and to imply that Canada can share in this praise as being alike in beauty and dignity. Perhaps, as the youngest British colony in North America, BC felt the pull more urgently to shore up its respectability by leaning on empire. It was new and rough around the edges, even compared to the Eastern Canadian provinces. Patricia Badir notes that Shakespeare gets conscripted into the most unlikely places in BC, the building of a railway, for instance. Yep. The Kettle Valley Railway, or KVR, completed in 1916, which just so happened to be the tercentenary of Shakespeare's death, linked BC's interior with its coast. Rather improbably, many of the KVR's stations were named after characters from Shakespeare's plays: Othello, Lear, Jessica, Portia, Iago, Romeo, Juliet. Apparently, these whimsical names were the idea of the chief engineer, Andrew McCulloch. The project was an engineering wonder in its day because of the inhospitable terrain the track had to cover. And yet, the stories that most capture the imagination then and now are of McCulloch's Shakespearean turn. Badir cites contemporary accounts of McCulloch performing play readings for his workers during construction, while Barry Samford suggests the station names and McCulloch's readings provided, quote, an ironic touch of gentility to the rail line. Why invoke Shakespeare in such a wild country? Badir notes a persistent desire in this project to view Shakespeare as a civilizing force, quote, as a light blasting through the wilderness, giving Shakespearean dimension to emptiness. In other words, in a world where the project of empire had imagined an empty virgin land waiting to be conquered and civilized, the very blankness of this imagined space needed, so colonists felt, Shakespeare to write its stories and make it a place. And I'm, for those of you who are aware of this, drawing upon the Lefebvrean sense of space and place. It is no accident the story of the KVR links a capitalist endeavor to the bard. Again and again, the two appear yoked together in the service of nationalism and empire. Badir calls readers' attention to how these kind of projects make plain the violence behind, quote, compelling tales of light over the darkness, prosperity over poverty, civilization over wilderness, poetry over noise. This English turn is described by Michael Dawson as a kind of selective amnesia, normalizing British control of the land and its resources, and encouraging both residents and visitors to imagine the resettlement of the city and province as, quote, benign, comforting, and consumable fare. There's a fantasy at work here, but it is a fantasy that only benefits and comforts the chosen. The white Anglo-settler population that longed to see their history as one of benevolent conquest over a savage land that awaited the civilizing touch of Britain, one that they could fill up with the cultural markers of the motherland to allay their fears of being in a mere empty space that did not need them at all. Victoria, as capital city of BC and namesake of Queen Victoria, took the desire for Englishness, imperial connection, and capitalist bardic civilization one step further than anywhere else in BC. The reasons behind this fervent adoption are complex, but they can be most clearly summarized as twofold: the desire for socio-economic survival and the desire for a sense of shared belonging with the capital city of the Commonwealth. Both of these impulses converged in the city until the story it needed and wanted to tell gradually became a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. David Smith notes that Victoria has been promoted as a, quote, quaint, jolly good capital, more English than England, since at least the 1920s. Yet its prehistory was far from good, jolly, or quaint, unless one chooses to describe rampant crime and drunkenness as jolly. Smith cites the 1854 diary of a local who comments wryly, quote, New Year's Day, a day above all days for rioting in drunkenness. Then what are we to expect of this young but desperate colony of ours, where dissipation is carried on to extremities? However, several factors contributed to a rapidly shifting perception of the city. Vancouver Island and the mainland territories of the present-day province of British Columbia became a unified colony in 1866, and the province joined the Dominion of Canada in 1871. But it was the only British-held territory on the west coast of North America by then, and it was surrounded by the prosperous and aggressive United States. Many Americans believed it was only a matter of time before BC became another state in the Union. Indeed, the BC Gold Rush meant that in some parts of BC, there were more Americans than British subjects, as prospectors from California, Oregon, and Washington flooded the land. Meanwhile, with the completion of the coast-to-coast Canadian Pacific Railway in 1886, its western terminus just outside Vancouver, Victoria, once the leader of industry and trade in the province, lost its position to the mainland. If BC was in danger of being absorbed by the US, the capital city of Victoria was in danger of dwindling into socioeconomic invisibility. The answer to both problems turned out to be a robust marketing campaign that reimagined Victoria as a European outpost in the New World. As Smith notes, Euro-Canadians' belief in their own cultural superiority and their conviction that Aboriginal people were a dying race caused the city's first tourist promoters to shun Aboriginal imagery in their promotional materials. Other minorities, such as Asians, were also excluded from the Victoria of the tourist pitchmen. The city, more English than England, began to take shape. This move had consequences. Dawson and others remind us that, quote, tourism both reflects and distorts the true character of a city or region. The fact that residents and tourists alike so readily bought into this English vision is, in large part, because they wanted to. The focus on the quaint English antecedents of the city erased other aspects and identities, which was highly convenient for a certain small settler elite. At first, this refashioning was mostly limited to tourist brochures. As early as 1902, the Tourist Association of Victoria, or TAV, launched marketing campaigns boasting that, quote, the combination of bold and picturesque country with old-fashioned English homes, their beautiful gardens, and air of comfort and contentment makes Victoria a delightful residential city. With time, the clear economic success of the marketing campaign led the city to consciously recast itself and its landmarks to fit a specifically English model. In these early days, if Indigenous peoples were mentioned at all, it was to suggest that the land and the people had naturally and wisely passed governance of the territory into the hands of the Europeans. Gradually, this attitude shifted slightly as the, quote, mysterious Indian culture of Indigenous people began to be perceived as a useful marketing tool. So here we have a brochure from 1939, where we've got lots of fishing and mountains and a totem pole. and the repeat reference to the thrilling enchantment of this place and the best vacation land. To maximize expenditure required increasing both the number of tourists and the duration of their visits. The best way to do this, many observers argued, was to offer Americans something exotic and foreign. In British Columbia, that meant capitalizing on both the province's imperial grandeur and the mystique surrounding its Aboriginal population. By the 1930s, incongruously, most brochures emphasized both Victoria's Englishness and tokenized its indigeneity, usually by dint of throwing in a totem pole or two. But the Englishness and the natural beauty of the land were given much more airtime than anything else. And perhaps this emphasis, while racially motivated, was also an attempt to seek safety in empire. For white Anglo-Canadian settlers, at least, this staunch affiliation with England gave them a way to carve out a cultural identity that has been highly successful in resisting assimilation into the dominant American culture with which it remains surrounded. Suddenly, the un-Americanness of Victoria became an attractant for the US tourists, rather than making Victoria a target for assimilation into the Republic. And what you see up here is a brochure advertising the Chinook of Puget Sound, taking people to Victoria and Vancouver Island, where we have young Scotsmen making friends with British bobbies, probably not very likely either. And further down the page, although you don't see it, there is reference to an Indigenous chief promoting the visit to this place. And in small language, it suggests that you can take the MV Coho to get there and back after you have arrived on the Chinook. And I actually worked for the Black Ball Ferry when I was an undergrad, so it still exists. This affiliation with the old country only intensified with time. Ultimately, Victoria became so self-consciously English because that Englishness, like the Shakespearean train stations of the KVR, lent it a secure cultural identity in uncertain times that was critical to the city's continued survival and prosperity, and at the expense of many other citizens, promoted a pleasant myth that lent a sense of gentility to a formerly rough boomtown. In other words, English Victoria was culturally pragmatic. There was a number of possible Anglicanizations that were considered or enacted to assist the project of Englishing Victoria. For instance, one member of the Victoria Island Publicity Board, with an eye to the main chance, campaigned with inconsistent success for various markers of bygone Englishness to be added to Victoria, including asking the police to remain dressed as English bobbies, and trying to convince gas stations to list gas as petrol and rebuild their stations to imitate Elizabethan architecture. His suggestions about the gas stations were a flop, but a token bobby remained in the city's inner harbor into the 50s. One of the most successful in execution and uptake was a reproduction of Shakespeare's wife's childhood home, Anne Hathaway's Cottage. In 1947, Sam and Rosina Lane moved from England to Canada and bought a mock Tudor mansion just outside Victoria in the city of Esquimalt. Originally called Rosemead, it was designed by well-known local architect Samuel McClure in 1909. The Lanes shared a passion for antiques and the old country, and they quickly set in motion their plan for introducing a bit of Elizabethan England on the shores of the Pacific. And this is a little advertisement blurb that talks about the sort of raison d'etre behind the project and what brought them together. Mrs. Lane herself was born in Victoria, although she went to school in England. And you'll notice that she makes a couple of interesting references. Observing these traditions, the aim of the Olde England Inn, which is what they renamed Rosemead Cottage, is to provide good cheer, food, shelter, and above all, real hospitality, as opposed to all the other hospitalities out there. The guest within our walls is invited to relax, to take mine ease in mine inn, even as did Washington Irving on his visit to the Red Horse in Stratford-on-Avon, so graphically described in his sketchbook. So she's referring here to the fact that Shakespeare's birthplace and other literary greats' haunts had already become part of a sort of heritage tourism trail that various literary aficionados had been visiting since the early 19th century at least. I mentioned before Mary Baker acting as guide for the original Shakespeare's Stratford-upon-Avon, Anne Hathaway's Cottage. She is described in great detail by some of these authors as giving them the sort of the real goods of what it was like in Shakespeare's time and providing them things like the bench where Anne Hathaway and Shakespeare courted. As you might guess, we have no evidence of where they courted or where that bench came from. It probably didn't exist in Shakespeare's time. So she's already consciously making the association between the project they're engaging in. She goes on, the many handsome pieces in the inn are part of the private collection, or rather the author goes on, of Mr. and Mrs. Lane acquired during their residence in England. The paneled and beamed baronial hall, they're aiming high here, provides a perfect setting for this remarkable collection of antiques. And then we've got some cred here. The replica of the Harvard House, the Garrick Inn, Dickens' Old Curiosity Shop, etc. As you can see, they didn't stop with Shakespeare. Sam Lane was himself also a chair of the Victoria Chamber of Commerce and had considerable influence upon shaping English-flavored local tourism initiatives in the 50s and 60s. The Lanes turned the mansion into the Olde England Inn, and then with the collaboration of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, UK, they set about building an exact replica of Anne Hathaway's thatched cottage and gardens. In fact, some sources in the Esquimalt archive claim it was so faithful that when the Stratford original burned in 1969, the trust reached out to the Lanes to use the replica to help to recreate the original. I reached out to the trust, and they could find no evidence of this fact in their archives. They diplomatically said that perhaps it was a different replica that had contacted the Victoria replica for assistance. And yes, there are other replicas. Be that as it may, the Lanes were quite serious in their authenticity project. They brought in master thatchers from abroad to help with the cottage roof. The hay was supplied and professionally prepared for thatching by a farm on the Saanich Peninsula in the Greater Victoria area. While the building materials were locally sourced and new, the Lanes filled the building, as well as the Olde England Inn, with antiques that were roughly period appropriate. A great point was made in the advertising brochures of noting that while the cottage was a replica, the furniture was, quote, authentic. And down here we have information that supposedly this bed once belonged to King Edward VII. And in the other picture, and you may notice that there is a Elizabethan lady sitting in the background there. And then we have the follow-up story of ghostly encounters. The ghost stories around Anne Hathaway's cottage only grew with the years, but this is one of my favorite. Ghost seen floating above 400-year-old bed shipped from England. Even so, their claims to periodicity and authenticity relied on their audience accepting that artifacts from all over Britain and Europe, ranging in date from the 14th to the 18th century, were close enough to Elizabethan Stratford to count as the same as the original cottage. Itself, an altered and heavily curated approximation of the original dwelling. Fortunately, the general public doesn't tend to be too stern when it comes to old things. Certainly, the cottage was the closest thing Victoria has ever had to a 16th century thatched farmhouse, although admittedly, that bar was low. The lane's stated aim was to open in time for the royal visit by the Queen of the new Elizabethan era, Elizabeth II. In 1959. This is where the project for empire and economy becomes explicit. The notion that a visit from a 20th century English queen would be sufficient to stir up popular interest in and acceptance of a link between Shakespeare, English royalty, and Victoria, BC may seem improbable, particularly to outsiders. But as we have seen above, there was already a well-established tradition of viewing the Canadian Commonwealth and Victoria in particular as representing a kind of metonymic relationship with a certain kind of Englishness. And in fact, the Tourist Association had attempted something similar only a few years previously when it attempted to capitalize on Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953 in England as a tourist opportunity for Victoria. And that's what that second image is doing. Enjoy a coronation year vacation in British Columbia. I would love to know what that entailed. David Matthews notes that the nostalgic neo-Gothic structures of Victorian England participated in a similar kind of asynchronous melange, as he calls it, of architectural features that deliberately obscured the new with a, quote, comforting gloss on the work through backwardness. These kinds of projects assemble a series of unrelated pieces from various times and places that nevertheless are accepted as generating the feel of antiquity and pass for markers of an unbroken historical tradition. Victoria's replica Elizabethan cottage certainly did that. The component parts of the cottage, Vancouver Island fir and cedar, local quarried stone, Saanich hay, English country garden flora, and European antiques, formed a convincing mosaic to untutored holidaymakers that reflected back their half-formed notions of Merry Olde England, transported to the Pacific Northwest. This mixture suggests a seamless transition between England and Canada that carefully aligns the ruptures of space, time, and conquest that are actually generated or actually entailed in this project. The advertisements make this positioning clear. I don't know if you can read that, but it says, step back in time to visit the full-size replica of William Shakespeare's wife's birthplace, authentically furnished with 17th century antiques. Guided tours explaining the Shakespearean lifestyle, it sounds like it's aspirational, and how many of our quaint experiences developed from their daily lives. And we've got a wench, I guess, sitting by the fire below. A friend of mine just reached out to say that she was one of the wenches that guided people around. So, a long-running newspaper ad refers to Anne Hathaway's cottage as a place where visitors can step out of the bustling 20th century into the Elizabethan period of romance and chivalry, into a location where the charm of old Victoria still lingers. This is from the Esquimalt Star in 1984. Elizabethan England, as a space of timeless leisure and romance, and an employed, lost, original Victoria are woven together as somehow inextricably the same. These words convey several sleights of hand, since not only was old Victoria nothing like Elizabethan England was not the age of chivalry, which was a nostalgic notion even in medieval England. And romance is a moving target that always already suggests the long ago and far away neverwheres of dragons, damsels, and knights. Moreover, the irony of suggesting that this whitewashed vision of authentic Victoria can only be found in the neighboring community of Esquimalt, itself always considered a separate community by the settlers, is carefully ignored. This curated picture of England/Victoria selectively remembers the most idealized and popularized elements of English history and forgets the rest. And as you can see from this brochure, we've got gestures to Tudor England, medieval English villages, the baronial hall, something that looks vaguely 18th century except for the woman in the negligee. It's a little bit all over the place. And oh yes, and don't forget the calligraphy style writing, just so you know it's authentic. Oops, I think I'm going too far forward. We'll go back. Ads also incongruously promise old country high teas, something that postdates the Elizabethan era by a few hundred years. Since tea drinking and high teas only became an English custom once the British Empire had secured control over large swaths of China and India. Thus, it appears to gesture to coherent time and place when it actually is calculatedly asynchronous, that is, out of time, and gestures towards a space and place that can only be mapped in the imagination. And I just want to note that the gentleman in the very back in red and the one serving the feast is indeed consciously trying to depict a version of Henry VIII and is in fact the Lane's son, who viewed his believed similarity in appearance to Henry VIII as a boon, and even went so far as to buy a baronial title so that he could list himself as the Lord of Shrewsbury, I think it was. So, the Queen and her consort paid Victoria a visit in June of 1959. The cottage opening didn't quite make the deadline. The grand opening is advertised in local newspapers for July 19th, 1959. And thus the Queen could not give it countenance by paying it a visit. It was wildly popular nonetheless. A 1963 clipping from the Leader asserts that the Old England complex, which included Anne Hathaway's cottage and Shakespeare's home by this point, had already had 1 million visitors. The recent visit of actual British royalty lent a kind of proximate authenticity to this asynchronous assemblage that seems to have paid off in spades. It quickly became a must-see on the sightseeing circuit and encouraged the 1961 genesis of the Royal London Wax Museum in Victoria proper and Fable Cottage, a kind of English fairy tale themed tea house set in the greater Victoria countryside. Improbable as it may seem, the cottage remained an enduring favorite for roughly 50 years before closing down as a result of bad financial decisions, disrepair, and a lack of local political will. So various civic ordinances, newspaper clippings, and building proposals in the Esquimalt Municipal Archives, to whom, again, I'm very grateful for their assistance, paint a picture of disorganization and logistical problems. No local master thatchers remained, shockingly. Various financial reverses forced the owner, this is Cyril Lane, now the son of the original owners, to sell at a loss. And the city balked at further renovations or expansions that might revitalize the site and make it financially viable. Eventually, the cottage and other storybook buildings that had been added over the years, Chaucer's Lane, the old curiosity shop, Shakespeare's home, which I mentioned, were bulldozed down. The original mansion renovated, and after several short-lived attempts to continue running the inn as a pub and or bed and breakfast, it shut down in the second decade of the 21st century. At the time of writing this paper, the site is under heavy construction, supposedly to maintain the original heritage house and add apartment buildings to the surrounding property, but no fixed completion date is in place. Perhaps it had outworn its plausibility in Victoria. In an era when Canada was finally waking up to the violence and erasure of colonization, it might have been deemed politically unfeasible to attempt a resurrection of jolly old Shakespeare when there was so much local Indigenous history, and so many non-European immigrant stories to reconstruct. And I'll just note that one of the members of the archives commented that the official line of the city was that reopening Anne Hathaway's cottage would cause too much traffic and noise, which seemed odd given that all the traffic and noise had been happening for years. But to me, that sounds like a way of avoiding the elephant in the room to a very faithful community who loved their thatched cottage. One might conceivably ask at this stage why Shakespeare and his family were conscripted into this self-fashioning process. As previously discussed, Shakespeare was mobilized regularly as a marker of the civilizing process of colonization in various in various Commonwealth countries. The immortal bard was held up as both a sign of inherent English superiority over other cultures and a civilizing tool. As his heavy use in Canadian textbooks suggests, Shakespeare was required reading for colonials, settler and Indigenous population alike. Envisioned as shining his wise white light through the savage New World darkness, he was conscripted into the great assimilation project of the British Empire. It is therefore an easy step from exemplar to identity marker. Most Canadians couldn't actually claim English birth, even if they had English ancestry, but by aligning themselves and their spaces with Shakespeare, they could gesture to a kind of performative kinship, a unified community that helped them survive in the shadow of the United States. Victoria's similar climate, island geography, and British emigre population made this cultivation of shared identity particularly successful. Moreover, the city was committed to making the project work. Victoria needed tourism to survive, and it had learned what the 20th century tourist wanted. As Smith notes, tourists of this era were a new breed. American, quote, and presumably Canadian vacationers of the post-war era headed out with precise goals and carefully structured itinerary. These later tourists set off for places they could already describe in great detail. In Victoria, this meant the Empress Hotel, Butchart Gardens, or the city's English woolen shops. And if the destination differed too much from their expectations, the explorers were disappointed. North American tourists hoped to find the predictably unusual and to discover what they already knew. In other words, they didn't want unexpected adventures. They wanted expected adventures. And they already knew Victoria was quaint, old-fashioned, and English. Therefore, all Victoria needed to do to be a success was to live up to those accepted truths. And I'll note that in the texts I've read, they have documents of tourists writing in to complain that there weren't enough Indigenous people and Mounties around when they visited. Even Victorians wanted to believe in this revisionist fairy tale, or I should say, some Victorians. In a post-war economic boom, when a need to believe in the unity and superiority of the British Empire was strengthened by a combination of Cold War nuclear fears, nationalism, and pride in the Allied eventual success of World War II, it is unsurprising that Victoria's English self-fashioning reached new heights. There was money available, new leisure time, and a desire to forget about the horrors and uncertainties of the past war or the haunting specter of nuclear holocaust. Although during the war, victory was anything but certain, afterwards people could reframe the story, as is the case with the routing of the Spanish Armada, which was mostly by storms, but eventually ascribed to God, which I guess is not wildly out of the realm of possibility, but it was God's desire to help the Protestants, in case you were wondering, in 1588, as evidence of the inevitable triumph of a superior society with all the problematic underpinnings of racism and nationalism. Indeed, people have been trained to think that way by wartime propaganda for 5 years. In an era where it was growing increasingly difficult to believe in the infallibility or nobility of the imperial project, the same year the Lanes began their Shakespearean Passion Project in Victoria, India and Pakistan gained independence from the British Empire. That's August 15th, 1947. The faithful or fanciful could look to Shakespeare as a heroic exemplar of superior British race and culture to prop up the waning dream of white Anglo supremacy. He beckoned from a past that seemed simpler and safer to the North American war-weary survivors of the mid-20th century. The ahistorical assemblage of high teas, beautiful gardens, and thatched stone cottages offered Victorians both an escape into a jolly past and an opportunity to cash in on the newly mobile and moneyed middle-class tourists that wanted their own escape from the tedium of modern life. Indeed, according to Dawson, a local psychiatrist suggested that this fairy tale pastiche even had curative properties, stating of Anne Hathaway's Cottage, "If more people spent more time at places like this, we'd have a heck of a lot less inmates in institutions." It's a pretty big claim and something that Big Pharma should maybe pay attention to. Victorians needed a story to tell about themselves. And since the available stories of violent conquest were unsettling and not particularly commercially viable, they retreated into something rich and strange that was worthy of the most fantastical Shakespearean plots. Ultimately, to the citizens of Victoria, cultural survival meant digesting and reproducing the sameness of an imagined Merry England that never was, rather than forging a new and unique identity more reflective of their lived reality. By hitching their city to the Bard, they could hang on to a comfortably nostalgic vision of empire for a little longer in a world full of bewildering sea changes. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Hang on here. We're going to do a question and answer. So now, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do is we will open up the floor, open up the house. We'll get some house lights up if we can to open it up for question and answers. If anybody has any questions, while you are thinking of highly intelligent things to say and ask, and I would like to present and say that the next time we have Dr. Mukai from the Modern Languages and Studies, who will be presenting all things languages, linguistics of VIU on Friday, October the 18th from 10 to 11:30. Now, Macy here will run around to various people as they have questions. Start over here.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. That was, as an American, really educational in a variety of ways. You mentioned something, if you could scroll back several pages to the picture of the tourism information. That one, yes. Go forward.
This one?
Yes. There was something that I'm wondering if you can comment on, because you've talked really well about this paradox between building something imagined and quote unquote known on top of the unknown and potentially feared. And it was phrased well in this thing on the right. Share the reflected pageantry of the coronation with your Canadian friends in a perfect vacation land where everything's quote unquote different. That to me like really encapsulates this contradiction that you've so well elucidated in your presentation, and I kind of, just for selfish reasons, want to hear you talk a little bit more about it, if that's possible.
Sure. Thank you for that, Bryn. Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples of the sort of weirdness of this, and so many levels of that weirdness. They seem to want Victoria to not be a place where actual people live. I'm surprised they stopped short of saying that the streets are paved with gold. This sort of perfect vacation land suggests that you can somehow retreat from modernity and your everyday cares into this safe space of nostalgia and history. And as someone who studies the past, history is not particularly safe. Elizabethan England wasn't particularly safe. So it's very fascinating that they choose this version of the idea. Just looking. So the difference seems to be, again, this odd, almost quilted together thing where you, on the one hand, were living in Elizabethan England or Victorian England or some melange of that. On the other hand, also indigeneity, because that's also cool. One of the things that you get the tourists starting to say is like, well, I thought, it's the Pacific Northwest. I thought I was going to see more quote unquote Indians and totem poles. And initially, as I said, they kind of avoid this until they realize that tourists want to see this. So they start out with this kind of like, don't worry, there's hardly any and they're safe. And then they move towards this like, they're super mystical, come see their stuff. And one tourism promoter even suggests, very offensively, I think, that the tourists should swing by the reserves and to view how the real Indigenous people live and maybe pick up some crafts. But I think the overall goal is to create this sense that you are entering the exotic, and that the incongruity of Old England and New World indigeneity didn't matter because it was also exotic anyway. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, and they also like to throw in, I didn't include any of these, what I can only assume are made up legends. They'll say things like, "Ah, yes, the Forbidden Plateau up island. Legend has it among the local Indigenous population that, if you went there, it was taboo," which of course taboo is not even it's a word borrowed from somewhere else, but so they even start to sort of bring in the frisson of scariness at a certain point. Thanks.
Hello, that was a lovely presentation. I really appreciate it. Don't you think that the marketing was directly in competition with Hollywood? Because as growing up at that time, I mean, in British Columbia, we didn't have a lot of options for vacations except California or Victoria. Like, I didn't live in Victoria. But what we knew about the world was pretty much shaped by Hollywood. And so there were the very English, but there was also the Indigenous people were from Westerns that I grew up with, So we did have a kind of small view of the world as a culture at that time, in the 50s, I'm talking like the late 50s and early 60s. We were I feel like we were a pretty naive society that just kind of looked small for to see the world in some way that wasn't really as sophisticated as we have now. Sort of, we didn't get to go to England, but we could go to Victoria. Kind of, that was basically how I grew up. That's all I want to say. Anyway, I just thought the marketing thing with Hollywood was just pretty, and Disneyland especially, was pretty much going on. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, it's the newly mobile society, but mobile how far? As you say, I think very few people could ever dream of going to England or very far away. And so having these attractions that produced a sense that you were participating in things you'd heard about in the movies or from history or in your classroom, that was the way to make it accessible. And I mean, one of the conversations I had with one of the older archivists at Esquimalt, she was bemoaning that, we'd lost the last good attraction in Victoria. But all the other problems of that aside, I just don't know if that works anymore because so many more people can and do go to England. You're not dealing with an expat community that maybe vaguely, has memories of home but has no hope of getting back there. You're not dealing with a community of born and raised settler colonials who have been told that England is the apex that they should desire to go to, but they're never going to get there. I think you're right that this was very much about, okay, the population can't go that far anyways, so why not us? We can bring them some of this stuff. And I think, as I said, I think the Lanes were genuine in their desire to try and create something enjoyable. And I think they really loved old stuff as much as they say they did. So I think that it was certainly something that worked for its time. I don't know that it would work so well now, although we do have the medieval times industry, which is certainly, I've actually been to 2 of them in the United States, which is all about that, like, participate as a wench, or like, cheer a joust, and, have your flagon, so I don't know, maybe it still works, but I think it's probably less gripping than it was when, our options were smaller, and, we didn't have all the information at our fingertips either that we do now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. I really enjoyed that. I grew up on the island as well. And so I grew up surrounded by all kind of British cosplaying. And at York, I used to work with somebody, Ken Gibson, who was very fond of saying that Victoria was where Victorian England went to die. But I was just wondering too, when you think about the lanes, and I was also thinking about that ad where you pointed out the real hospitality comment. Is this also maybe sort of the last gasp of the kind of portable domesticity that Janet Meyer talks about, where the role of, in the 19th century, of women immigrants from Britain was to be as kind of bearers of culture. So is this kind of maybe tied into that? I'm just used to seeing a lot of 19th century promotional material in youth culture, especially from Britain, about the responsibilities and roles of migrating to the colonies.
Thanks, Terry. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you'll notice from a lot of the promotional materials that there are a lot of depictions of women doing domestic things, sitting in bedrooms, sewing, cooking, looking seductive and non-threatening. I do think that there is something in that, and I will note that Sam Lane, one of his tourist gimmicks was, I'm going to get this wrong, but it was something like the crumpet ambassadors, and they went down to Seattle maybe to give out buttered crumpets to the tourist bureau there, and they I think successfully campaigned to make the crumpet the official, I don't know, snack of Victoria at one point. So, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I think you're right. Like there's this, and there's, in many ways, the Elizabethan England that we are seeing is heavily inflected by the Victorians' renewed interest in the medieval and early modern period. And so the version of Shakespeare and the Tudor era that we get is heavily influenced by Victorian Gothic turn as they and their interest in medievalism and Shakespeare. So I think absolutely it would have those valences, and I think it's no accident too that a lot of the time the guides, both in England and in Victoria, were women. So I think you're absolutely right about that. And I'll also note that other sort of Victoria beautification projects involved things like setting up exclusive clubs and making nice gardens and tea shops, all of which often have a lot of women working, at least behind the scenes. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. This was really, really fascinating. And I had a question about whether this space was ever employed as a place where Shakespeare's work was actually ever performed or invoked in any way. I know that, well, I don't know, but I believe that Anne Hathaway's cottage was never a place that Shakespeare spent a lot of time. so maybe it wouldn't be authentic to do that. But I am wondering, I am wondering about that. Yeah, whether it was ever a place where that connection was made in terms of productions or things like that.
Thank you, Catherine. As far as I'm aware, no. I do know that there were, I mean, again, yes, I suppose it wouldn't be authentic because, yes, Shakespeare spent hardly any time there, especially after he became famous. He spent hardly any time in Stratford-upon-Avon, so also strange that that's the center where we all go to see him, both in Canada and the old country. Also, yeah, I think the kind of performances that happen instead are these things like these, baronial feasts. Like you get them presenting a decorated boar's head for some reason, which, yes, they did do at times in England and other places, but it doesn't match up very well with high teas, which there's a lot of evidence to suggest that women's clubs would go and book Anne Hathaway's cottage to have gatherings and have a high tea as part of their experience, which again, like, I don't know. Shakespeare was living in London, so he may have encountered tea. It would have been somewhat showing up from the New World, but just barely. Or not New World, but the world that they had only just managed to make contact with. But it's highly unlikely he ever drank tea on a regular basis, perhaps even at all. So the performances seem to be these almost like feasting and acting performances of cosplaying, really, more than of the plays, which you would think would be an obvious choice, especially since they have a whole complex, they have a garden. We were just talking about how Midsummer Night's Dream is popularly performed outside for various Shakespeare in the Park endeavors around the world. Could be an easy choice. I do know, the other weird fact I have is that when Elizabeth visited in 1959, the city commissioned a sculptor to make a bust of her head. And then, after she left, they got in a big fight about who was going to pay for it. And as part of that fight, they couldn't decide where it should go. I don't know where it actually ended up, but I do know that the Lanes made a bid for it, saying that Anne Hathaway's cottage would be its natural home. I assume because another Elizabeth was alive when Shakespeare was alive, which would be the only connection. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I know.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. That was wonderful. I just wanted to ask, like, when you speak about the obsession, what I'm assuming is the obsession that people had with Shakespeare, would that be like everyone or just like people from specific classes? I ask because, I couldn't help but draw a parallel between, what happened here in Victoria and where I'm from. I'm from the former colonies, India. So, even now in India, we have like these grand English departments who've got like really big obsessions with Shakespeare. So, when you analyze the class aspect of it, like, what's your comments on that?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's not only a question of class in various former colonies, but in England itself. I still remember being taken on a tour by a very well-known archaeologist guiding us through medieval London and pointing out various viewpoints when a couple of construction workers started heckling him, going, "Oi, are you Shakespeare?" And, us North Americans were like, what is happening here? And he's like, "Oh, this happens all the time." And basically they were mocking him for being some poncy, fancy Shakespeare person. They got the wrong era, but, close enough. But I think you're right. I think in Victoria, it was popular not just with the sort of upper but middle aspirational class, but I highly doubt that people who were in the, less economically stable positions were worrying about how English Victoria was, or whether they could somehow, engage with Shakespeare. I think probably they would also have looked at those people and been like, who are you? Who are you trying to be? And I think I know from a friend of mine who has her roots in Soviet Belarus that the Soviet bloc had a similar, they're not supposed to have classes during the communist era, but there was like the intellectual elite who unexpectedly aligned themselves with Shakespeare, among others. And I don't think, although part of the project in Soviet era was to bring Shakespeare and art to the masses, I doubt that, everyone out there was worrying about how they fit in with Shakespeare. So I think you're absolutely right that this is a class preoccupation for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, Sarah, I really, really enjoyed your presentation, and maybe for a different reason than others did, but so here's my context. I'm the first person in our family that was born in Canada. My parents were more British, and so one of the thoughts that came up when you were speaking was like, why in the hell would my father decide to leave England and come to British Columbia specifically? And the other kind of context, was there's a book that years ago I read. It's called A Panorama of the Rockies by a man, Robert Stanfield. And this was his idea, that rather than people coming to a place first, like the population growth that occurred was really selling this imaginative space, the space of exploration, but like you say, it's romantic, the geography. And I wonder if somehow, like in just terms of the order of discourse, that for Brits coming or English coming here, what you're talking about is also part of a larger narrative that brought those immigrants here. And again, my mother would go to Victoria because the Queen was there and she had to meet the Queen. So all of that, and again, 3 o'clock was tea time. And
Yeah.
so again, is that, when you're doing this, are you looking at a kind of larger kind of discourse that again centers on English culture and again Shakespeare? Years ago, a professor of mine, again another Englishman, said that India was colonized not by 50 brigades of Bengal Lancers, but by, again, Shakespeare and the dictionary, right? So what do you think about that? That's a lot to ask, but.
Yeah, well, I am working this up for publication as part of a larger collection on reparative Shakespeare. So I will be spending more time on talking about the sort of tradition of Shakespeare tourism specifically. But of course, that is part of that project of, English Empire and, how they both wanted to come to this fantasy land. They wanted it to be the same as home. They wanted it to be different from home. They wanted it to be both somehow. I think that, yeah, it did help that the climate was similar, that, English plants grow really well here, perhaps too well, as we all know. Witness, well, not in English, but Scots broom is very overrepresented. So I think that there was a comfort value to this and a sort of a chance to start anew where you could start out at a higher level, perhaps. I also grew up very much an Anglophile myself. Full disclosure, I hosted a high tea for my friends in high school because I'm a giant nerd and also an Anglophile. So I speak with love, but skepticism of this desire. And I think I think I'm just starting out in this area because, as I said, I usually inhabit 16th century London. But I think there's a lot to be said for going in those directions and thinking about how, again, how Shakespeare colonized the empire through books, as you say. I have begun collecting Canadian textbooks from the early 20th century, partly because of the way they use, the Romantics and Shakespeare to sort of shape their moral and aesthetic identity of the youth. So I think all of those things are out there, and I'm certainly wanting to do more with it. Don't know how much the wider project will focus, I'm not sure how much the sort of wider empire will get into this particular publication and how much it will be more Shakespeare heritage tourism in this particular venue. But yeah, I think, it's got a lot of potential. So.
I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Please.
Thanks so much.